So, Anna, you and your boyfriend had an interesting experience regarding our dear friend Black Red Guard here. Would you like to tell the audience a little bit about that?
So, yes. So, for context for this, I wasn't with my boyfriend at this time. I was at home because I had class the next day. So, I was just like, like at a university. So, I was like, I'm not partying with him. But he texts me at 1:15 a.m. and he says, "Okay, so I may have insulted crackers and cracker culture and gotten kicked out of a cracker bar, but I don't know why I assumed it was related to me, referring to the attendees as what they are, in parentheses, crackers. I was escorted out." Basically. So he got kicked out of a bar for quoting our lovely guest here, Black Red Guard, who said gun control no, cracker control yes. I don't know why he was at a cracker bar, considering that he lives in Baltimore. I don't think there's many of those, but he found himself there, and he and so he texted me that at like 1 a.m. and I was like, what the heck? And I just started thinking about that, how like he and his friend had gone there and definitely gotten kicked out just because they quoted this amazing guy that is here with us today, Black Red Guard. How are you doing today?
I am wonderful, and I'm. Well, I was going to say I'm sorry that your boyfriend had that experience, but going to bars frequented by the lower element of colonizers is something that I would greatly not recommend
Warn
doing.
against. Yeah,
So in a
they
way, I'm
learned their
not sorry.
lesson.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm a meme. What can I say? I guess I'm a meme. I'm a meme that gets people in both political and drinking trouble.
Yeah, you inspire revolt and rebellion in bars. I will say that.
An
Your
icon.
voice is being silenced.
You know what else was a revolt and a rebellion that happened at a bar?
Ooh, I don't know.
The reason for the season?
Smooth.
Oh, that was
Very
nice.
smooth.
Lovely.
All right. Well, we don't
Well,
want to spoil
hi
anything.
guys. This
Sorry, Anna, you go ahead.
so welcome to Marxism Today, the one and only podcast where we talk about Marxism. That's a lie. It's okay. I am here today with Paul Connolly and the mighty Black Red Guard, and yours truly, Notorious Kasamung Anna. Paul, do you want anything to say?
Well, yeah, today is part of Pride Month. We're going to be discussing the history of Pride. We're going to be looking at queerphobia and where it comes from, and as well as discussing the relationship between the queer movements for liberation and Marxism, and how we should approach it, how we should relate to it, and how we should understand it from a class-oriented perspective. Now, I have to say, Anna and I are absolutely delighted and excited to be talking to the almighty Black Red Guard about this topic in particular.
That's right. Just puff up my Everest-sized ego more than it already is. See, that's
All
how
right,
you get that.
Chair-
Yeah, make me the sixth or
Chairman
seventh or
BRG.
eighth head.
Chairman BRG.
the seventh heads, I
Move
believe.
heaven and
Yes.
earth.
Y'all are killing me. Y'all are killing me. I just want to sit and read my books, but y'all insist that I be the 18th head of what you call it. Somebody's
Well,
got to do it.
somebody has to do it, and you have been doing it as well. You know, you recently released a really useful stream. I think it was on Twitch, and now it's on YouTube, called "Combating Queerphobia on the left in quotation marks, and in the Black community." And I really recommend that everybody checks this out. You can find it linked in the description box below. So, Black Redguard, the icon. Would you like to introduce yourself, or reintroduce yourself to the good people watching the show today? I know it's been a little while. You have been on the stream before. It's probably like, I think it's over 2 years ago now at this
Yeah, probably
stage.
2 or 3 years ago. It's been a while.
It's been a
But
while,
I
yeah.
remember watching that live. Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm
that was
really
a lot of
glad.
fun.
Yeah, really glad to be here with two comrades that I greatly admire and respect. You all have the dankest takes. Oh God, I'm talking like a Zoomer. But yeah, I'm really glad to be here in this month at this point in time. In the United States, we have a lot of really cool stuff popping off. The struggle against Cop City in Atlanta, and all different types of things, unionization efforts. And one thing that you will notice is that queer people, particularly trans people, are like front and center. And there's a, of course, there's a struggle between two lines in every movement, every organization, every party, what have you. But there's a very worrisome reactionary trend by people who call themselves patriotic socialists or MAGA communists, which doesn't make any sense. But, anyways, these people are deriding our trans comrades and trying to sever the T off the LGBTQT, which is ridiculous because when you look at the history of the queer struggle, where we came from and how we got where we are today, trans people were front and center in the vanguard. But going back to the subject of two line struggle, there is and there has always been, this was the case in the New African Civil Rights Movement, this was the case in the indigenous land liberation movement, this is the case everywhere, that you have certain bourgeois elements that, because of their access to capital, their social connections, their positions in the NGO-ocracy, certain people with bourgeois politics and the desire to transform themselves into ruling class politicians sort of arrogate unto themselves leadership in movements and stifle proletarian voices. And what the reactionaries that I mentioned earlier are doing is implying that all queer people or all people who insist that we have a stake, we meaning queer people, have a stake in the liberation of everybody, they're implying that we are somehow imperialist interests because Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Wells Fargo and all of these other Fortune 500 companies that do admittedly horrible things have decided that queer people are a customer base that they want to try to tap into. And so it's really important that while we maintain a firm critique of what we call pink washing or using fake concern for the rights of queer people to justify and cover up doing horrible things. For example, this is something that frequently comes up in discourse on Israel. They mentioned the fact that the Middle East is historically a very Islamic and socially conservative area, and they act as if Israel is some bastion of tolerance because it's a so-called liberal democracy, meaning settler colonial piss hole in this region, and because Tel Aviv has a pride parade. So that's probably the most notorious example of pink washing. Also in Uganda, there was recently a very concerning and worrisome anti-queer law that was passed and signed into law by the president. And they're acting like, oh, the third world doesn't support the LGBTQ agenda. The third world is not with this imperialist trash. I'm like, first of all, like Uganda, Nigeria, Rwanda, Zimbabwe, all of these places, like, how exactly did Christianity get there? Like, did it just organically appear? Now, Christianity has been in Africa since the time of the historical Christ, because like there's some stuff I haven't read theology in a while, which is sad because I went to a Catholic school. Anyways, um, but like you had the Queen of Sheba and Solomon and all of that. Anyways, so Christianity has been in Africa longer than it's been in Europe, but the reactionary, socially regressive, money hungry, prosperity gospel, missionary evangelical bullshit, that's something that comes from the West and comes from the United States. Like a lot of these presidents and legislatures and what have you that are forcing this shit through, they went to mission schools. So when we see these anti-queer laws and you see all of these reactionary bourgeois liberals like voicing this fake concern, like they're basically talking about stuff that their country is responsible for. And the MAGA communists and Pat Sucks are just idiots that want to smuggle reactionary, I would say, into the communist movement, but they're not really a part of the communist movement. So, yeah, I'll shut up now.
No, please don't. That was really,
Never
really
shut
interesting.
up. That was awesome and so true.
Yeah, no, no, very useful
Also,
analysis.
I
And a
wanted to
good.
point out I'm wearing a Love is Love beanie that says Love is Love in Yiddish, and I also have my pride flag in the background. We were just talking about commercialization of pride, but I don't care. Look at these. They look amazing. I'm in theme. But yeah.
Well, rainbow capitalism is, you know, we hate it and love it. It's nice to be able to get our flags. It's nice to be able to get all these things. But at the same time, to be aware of what's going on here. And as Black Red Guard really importantly mentions, that within the movement for queer liberation, there is this division between proletarian and bourgeois elements. And I think one of the central themes that we're going to be addressing over the course of this stream is this question of who's really leading the movement right now, and is it us? Is it working people, or is it the capitalists, the capitalist imperialists, and their lapdogs, their comprador lapdogs, and so on? And if it's not us, then how do we change that? How can we address that issue? How can we get this front and center, and how can we combat this wave of reaction which emerged, as of course was mentioned by Black Red Guard, the PATSOCs, reactionaries in Britain, and so on and so forth. How do we combat that, and what should we do? So, in order to understand these, in order to give a firm basis for answering these kinds of questions, when it comes to the to do the dickhead Marxist thing, the quote, the queer question, which is always how it goes.
I hate
Oh
referring to
God.
things as
I
questions.
hate
Like,
Even
yeah,
even the good texts, like towards a scientific analysis of the quote, the gay question by the group that broke away from the RCP USA, even they're doing it. So
it gets even worse when you go back to the 20s and 30s. And like, I can just imagine like a CPUSA dude walking up to somebody and to a working person in Harlem and be like, "Hello, comrade Negro. Have you heard our position on your question?" Like, oh,
Jesus
we a
fucking
I
Christ.
question
can't.
now.
That's like okay. I have like I think trauma from reading The Jewish Question by Karl Marx, like still,
Oof.
which like
Yeah.
it's such the
Solidarity.
worst.
I've heard horrible things. I've never read it though.
God, oh, he couldn't be perfect, and he had to so
Yeah.
get that. God damn it, it makes you so mad. But yeah, I feel you.
So with that, let's just put that behind us. Let's put this whole the question on X, whatever. Let's just stop doing
Let's
that from
put
now
the
on.
answer forward.
Let's put the
No
answers
more
forward.
questions.
No more questions. Although we will answer some questions during the stream. We might,
Yeah, LOL.
if people have questions in the live chat and they want us to do a few Q&As towards the end, do type at Marxism today. Put your questions, and if we have time at the end, we'll answer some of the good questions, if they're good, being key. All right, let's get this started. We are going to get into scientific analyses of where queer oppression comes from historically. First, I think it's important that we discuss Pride Month. It is Pride Month now. It used to be Pride Day, Pride Week. Now it's a whole Pride Month. Some of this is connected, of course, to rainbow capitalism, but of course, it also has very radical roots, which I think are important to discuss. So, where did this come from? Where did Pride come from? Would any of you like to jump in and take that?
I can do that. So Pride officially began in 1970. It began to commemorate the 1 year anniversary of the Stonewall riots that began on June 28th, 1969 at the Stonewall Inn in Manhattan. So the riots happened because the police raided the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in New York City, something they do regularly because the police had criminalized what they called cross-dressing or dressing as like a different gender than what they perceived you to be. And the majority of bars because of this in New York City that were gay bars were then owned by the mafia because they were illegal. So this in turn gave police an excuse to be able to raid these inns and arrest queer people indiscriminately and also extort gay clubs for protection money. So this sparked a 3-day riot in which queer people fought back against the police. They threw like petrol bombs at the police, they barricaded themselves in the inn, and they were out on the streets every single day. So that is the beginning of Pride Month.
Yeah, and this is really an authentic expression of rebellion against violent police harassment. And what's important about this is that it was headed by revolutionary black and brown queers like Marsha P. Johnson. That part's often, it's whitewashed out of it. It's whitewashed out of it. It's all, we get certain ideas in the media of the movement being led by white, upper class, gay men, and that's
I
kind of it.
actually mentioned, if you watched my Queerphobia stream, there's this very popular among the proletariat and lumpen. I don't even want to call him like he's a commentator. His name is Dr. Umar Johnson. And like if I recall correctly, he said that like Stonewall was an attempt to whitewash or wash out the revolutionary black movement at the time with queer issues. And I'm like, this guy, like, who gave him his doctorate? Like, who let you walk across the stage? Who read your dissertation? Who let you write a thesis? I believe his doctorate is in psychology, but I'm really glad you brought that up because, like, these were not wealthy queer people, like people that you would see on TV, or like these are not your Caitlyn Jenners, these are not your Pete Buttigieg's. I think I pronounced the bastard's name right, or your D-Ray McKesson's. Like these were homeless people. These were people who, if you've never watched Paris is Burning, you should. Like it shows how queer people during this era and later going up to the 80s lived. Like these guys and girls and people in general would have to steal clothes from stores because they couldn't afford them. There's a whole category in the ballroom scene called executive realness, where it's basically, yeah, I'll never get to be a Wall Street financier or a banker. Throw this phone across the room, but I can dress like one. I'm going to steal your clothes, and eventually we're going to conquer your uh, glass castle. So very glad you brought that up.
Well, yeah, the thing is, you've done a really good job at the start addressing the fact that, it's actually trans, in many cases, it's trans women who are really at the vanguard of struggle now in the United States of America. And this was the case then as well. Black trans women like Marsha were at the vanguard of this struggle, and that's something that, unfortunately, we're seeing a reactionary trend of trying to cordon off the trans liberation movement from the rest of the struggle for queer liberation recently. You have these dipshits like LGB Alliance, and they're dropping the T, they're removing T, removing intersex people, and so on and so forth. And it's completely reactionary. The entire movement has been built by and led by trans and primarily women of color from the start, from its inception. So very important points to emphasize when we're talking about this. So this was originally, a radical-led movement that stood in solidarity with all struggles against imperialism and class society, and of course Stonewall led directly to the establishment of the Gay Liberation Front, which I think is also the people who are checking out this stream will appreciate that. The Gay Liberation Front was of course named after the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. So you can already see those connections with imperialism. It had a much wider scope than what we might think of as just the movement for, LGBT plus rights and reforms and things like that. So it saw itself as being part of the larger struggle against imperialism and class society. And of course, this movement would include revolutionaries not only like Marsha, but also like Sylvia Rivera, And within this, you begin to see contradictions emerge. On one side, you have this radical queer liberationist current, which really seeks to overthrow imperialism and class society, the conditions which gave rise to the oppression of queer people in the first place. But on the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, you also have single-issue assimilationists. These are people who were more or less content to let the capitalist imperialist exploitation continue, providing that upper-class white queers are able to enjoy the spoils of capitalist exploitation for themselves too, often at the expense of working class queers, primarily black and brown queers, So you can see already within the movement that there's a division emerging between the revolutionaries, who represent a working class standpoint on one hand, and then the reformists, who represent more of a bourgeois and petty bourgeois reformist standpoint on the other. So we see this division within the queer movement, and I think that it's important to draw out those distinctions right from the start of this conversation. Do you know?
Yeah. And I think that we can also tell how this diverged against the class interests of the working class. Queer people like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson, who had led the first initial riots, because a little after the first anniversary of the Stonewall riots, these queer revolutionaries founded STAR. And in condemnation of queer assimilationist betrayal of the working class liberation politics for soft assimilationist liberal politics, as well as the removal of the importance of violently opposing the ruling class and recognizing them as the root of their subordination. So STAR was a mutual aid and protection organization that was made up of working class people, including many homeless and prostituted masses. Star was reportedly Sylvia Rivera's baby, but Marsha P. Johnson was an active member and an avid promoter, and she was quoted saying, "Star is a very revolutionary group. We believe in picking up the gun, starting a revolution if necessary. Our main goal is to see gay people liberated and have free and equal rights that other people have in America." As it was founded by a revolutionary Boricua, Sylvia Rivera, Star became affiliated with the Young Lords Party, which was a revolutionary socialist Puerto Rican party which fought for the liberation of Puerto Rico from U.S. colonialism and against racism against their community here in the United States. But unfortunately, Star was only active for 3 years because it became ostracized by the queer rights movement, which shows you how quickly queer liberation fell into assimilationist politics at the hands of the white petty bourgeoisie, whose class interests varied widely with those of the working class queer population.
Yeah, very very well explained. This is something we see with a lot of what people would sometimes call like identity struggles, like national struggles and things like this as well. The last time Black Red Guard was on, we were talking about the national struggle, the struggle for national liberation, Black nationalism, Irish nationalism, and so on and so forth. And there's always been the single issue approach, and there's always been the more broader understanding of how this struggle fits into the struggle for liberation from class oppression in its entirety. And so we see this. So we see this division of class standpoint that emerges between the two currents within the queer movement. There's the working class revolutionary standpoint that seeks to abolish all oppression, all of it, and a bourgeois or petty bourgeois reformist standpoint that seeks to only abolish the one specific form of oppression that's shared with upper class queers, leaving all other forms of oppression intact.
Exactly. And this carries over into the Black movement as well. Well, I guess that you can't say there's really a thing as a Black movement, the Black struggle against depression in the United States. Like, you have cultural nationalists, the Panthers, we call them pork chop nationalists, the ADOS people, American descendants of slaves, FBA, Foundational Black Americans, all of those different types of groups, people like Dr. Umar Hoteps that are extremely xenophobic. Like, I can count innumerable times that I've seen them saying the most horrible things about Mexican migrants and others who come from overseas, because they're like, oh, they're stealing our, basically the same shit you hear white Trump supporters say. Like, they're stealing our jobs. It's just garbage. But single issue stuff like, okay, we're strictly a Black thing. But I'm not an opponent of, like, because SNCC did the same thing. They expelled white people because when you have like a lot of white people and a lot of Black people, especially white people that are working in Black neighborhoods, it's sort of a power dynamic and a psychological dynamic among the masses. Oh, white people are more competent, so we're going to work with them, as opposed to the Black organization that's underfunded, that's doing the same thing across town. So that's why people like Kwame Ture, known to many as Stokely Carmichael, was like, white people need to work in white neighborhoods. Anyways, I'm getting on a tangent. So when we see like single issue stuff, oh, we're solely Black, and we are going to flatten all of the class contradictions and come at this strictly from a racial angle. It makes it easier for co-optation. That's exactly what happened in the queer liberation movement, because they lost that anti-imperialist, that, I hate to use the term intersectional perspective, but they lost the perspective that all of these oppressions are connected. And they started to focus narrowly on queer rights, and they never really like specified what is queer rights. Rights for whom, as Lenin would say, like liberty for whom? Okay, we can get married now. Well, we can get married until they overturn Oberbergfell, but we can get married now. Okay, if you are a homeless trans woman living in a vacant building, like how exactly does being able to marry benefit you right now? You have nothing to eat. You have no job. You're living in a vacant building. You have no way to get around town. So that's why many queer activists are realizing that, hey, getting married ain't shit. A fucking wedding cake ain't nothing. You can't even afford a wedding cake. So it's
Yeah.
really important. And it's really heartening that queer activists, especially trans people, who are always the vanguard, are coming to this realization and are bringing class analysis back to the movement.
Yeah, really
Yeah,
well
if I
put.
could add something on that. So what you're saying speaks to me a lot because like in I think like a summer or two ago, I was doing some community work by like canvassing for an LGBTQ organization. And I was the field manager. So a lot of the responses that we would get from people is, well, gay people already have rights, right? Like you guys can marry, like what more do you want kind of thing. But at the same time that people were heckling us for like and saying that I would have to keep an eye out, like especially for the trans youth within our ranks, because people would come up to them and like solicit them, right? Because they were trans and because, they're working class, they're workers, they're out here like working in the sun in the middle of like DC trying to ask people to care about queer rights. And I think that like when we think about queer rights here in the United States, we think that the United States is so developed as a country, like whatever, when it comes to queer rights, and that this is one of the best places to live as like a gay person. And that kind of depends on what state you're in. And the majority of states still allow conversion therapy. The majority of people in the United States, especially when it comes to trans people, are extremely reactionary. Like it really just goes and it you can just talk to any person and ask them about like the like existence of trans people and you will see this, right? And that's because our media and our politicians are out here and they are profiting off of this rhetoric, this fear mongering against trans people. So when people say that the United States, like, we don't need to do anything else, we have gay rights, you don't have to like be afraid about like being queer here in the United States, and especially in the case of like trans people, that's really a bold-faced lie, and it really shows the class differences, right? Because if you're a queer person, for example, like a gay man that lives in Brooklyn in a gentrified area, maybe you don't feel oppressed anymore, right? But the majority of people here in the United States who are queer, just like the majority of any community in the world, are still working class, right? And if you're from, for example, like the queer community, whether you're from like a queer community of color, a working class community, you will be more like you will continue to be oppressed by this class society. So we do need to put class into this because, as we will talk about in a little bit, class is at the root of why queer people are oppressed. So yeah.
So, speaking of queer oppression, we need to get into this and we need to have an understanding before we get into the root cause of that, and before we get into class society and history and all these things. So, what is queer phobia? Like, what actually is queer phobia? What does that mean? Does anyone want to take that?
You can take that, Paul. I
Okay.
believe in you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
let's hear some
We're
more from
putting
Paul.
this straight person on the spotlight.
oh
There
What do
you
you
shit.
go. Let's prove how much of an ally you are.
prove who you
Well, I can try my best. I don't know. I can certainly try my best. All right. So first of all, I think first and foremost, we need to ask, what does the word queer mean? Historically, I think a lot of people associate that with being like a slur. It's of course been reappropriated for a more positive use. Simply speaking, it would just mean different. Someone who's a little bit different, and specifically with regard to expressions of sexuality or gender that are different to the established customs of what we would call a heteronormative and patriarchal society. Heteronormative simply meaning that heterosexual gender relations and sexual relations are normalized, as that is held up as being what everyone should strive towards. And anything then that breaks from that is, of course, this established norm of the nuclear family based on, the stereotype of the dominant husband, the passive wife, the children to whom they can pass on their private property. That is queer. And queer phobia, or sometimes called queer antagonism, is this hatred of queer people and also queer elements within all people. These elements that just simply don't gel with the norms of the nuclear family. And I would say that it primarily affects today, I would say first and foremost, trans people, probably at the very center of it. And of course, also lesbians, gays, bisexual, intersex people, and so on. And I'd say something that's also interesting, and excuse me if I'm going too far with this, but we can also see elements of queerphobia directed at cis heterosexual people. A small example of this would be, for example, telling guys with long hair, men with long hair, to get haircuts. And this is in order to get them to adhere to the established gender roles of how a man should present himself. Now, obviously, that's going to be small fry compared to the actual queerphobic violence that's faced by queer people, but it does demonstrate and illustrate how queer antagonism really is bad for everyone. I also want to put a little asterisk beside that as well, because when we talk about men with long hair or features that are seen now as being, let's say, traditionally feminine or traditionally queer, these can often be ways for people to, let's say, test the water for, let's say, further transition. So you might be trans. You might go through some years of being like something like a punk or like a metalhead or something like this, some sort of hippie or something like that. You grow your hair long and you see what you think, you see how you feel with it. And there's space in society that leaves that's open, that's acceptable in society. It's acceptable to be a hippie or a metalhead or a punk or whatever it might be. It's not as acceptable yet to openly experiment with being trans. That's just not socially accepted right now. So yeah, that's the one thing I will say about that. But yeah, queer phobia and queer antagonism. Those are the kinds of things that come to mind when I think about it. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So what do
I
you think?
I think that well, I was gonna comment that the word queer is something that's used more like right now, and I guess in the United States. I don't know if it's used outside as well, I guess like in Ireland or anywhere else. But that word has a very heavy connotation. So basically, we refer to ourselves, like, I mean, at least the way that I see it, like as queer, because queer was seen as something that was like bad, it was different, right? But we see it as like a word that like truly encompasses, without kind of like putting a more distinctive label, what like we are, right? We don't conform to like this patriarchal notion of like who you should be, what your gender should be, who you should love, right? But there are some people from older generations that don't like using the word queer, and that's totally fine too. Because like sometimes it was used like, like as an insult or like as a bad word, and some people still feel kind of like adverse to that, which is why words kind of like bisexual, gay, lesbian started being using more, which are also words that can be used like exchangeably with queer, and transgender as well is within that category. So I would say that, just adding that.
Yeah, really,
Yeah.
really important points. Black Red Guard, did you want to add anything else to that? I'm not sure. Did I pass the allyship test, or how did that go?
You're
Uh,
fine for now.
I don't know. I'm voting to behead him. But especially within like colonized communities, particularly Black communities, because that's the community that I come from, it's strange. Like the queer antagonism and queerphobia has a bit of a warped historical basis because, okay, there's a pretty strong movement. I don't want to call them men's rights activists, but they're traditionalists. They want to essentially pursue this Victorian style view of the Black family. They want to rebuild the Black family. By Black family, we mean nuclear family. Of course, you know that's bullshit if you studied anything about our history, because even going all the way back to Africa, many of our societies and nations were matrilineal and matriarchal. But we were brought here and we were inculcated and brainwashed in this Calvinist, Puritan, American, warped version of money hungry Christianity, where if you don't have mom, dad, who rules everything, and many children in a house on a plot of stolen land of your own, you are not a real family. So a lot of Black men are working to try and reconstruct this idealized version of our family that we have never really had. And that is where a lot of queer antagonism is rooted, because if you do not carry on your family line, I know that's very futile, but that's literally what a lot of these guys believe. You are not a man because your genetic material is going to die out. And there's a very common notion that homosexuality and queerness was sort of taught to us. I mean, I don't know how you can teach somebody something like that. Like no matter what, I will never be straight, no matter how much you try to teach me how to be straight, anyways. And there's an obsession and fascination with machismo and masculinity. I've heard this occurs in Latino communities as well. But like, because, okay, let's just say it's 1845, right? You're a slave, you're a guy, you're an enslaved African. You are married to a woman. The slave owner can come and do whatever he wants to your woman. And again, notice I'm saying you're a woman because this is patriarchy. So he can come and do whatever he wants to your wife. You have to raise his half white kids. And you have no means to defend yourself without being brutally murdered in front of your wife and his children and your children too. And there's a movie about the Deacons of Defense, um, a black armed group that provided protection to the community during the civil rights era. And a white dude tries to do something to one of the deacon's daughters. And this guy defends himself and his daughter. And the cops come and they're like, "Did you pull a gun on that man?" Or I think he beat his ass. Anyway, something violent happened to this white man from a black man, which, if you know anything about the South, was a big no-no. And the deacon was like, "I'm defending my daughter." And the cop is like, "That is not a right you have." Of course, he also uses the N-word because South. And when you are conditioned that a man is someone who is able to defend his family, one who owns property, one who does not take shit from other men, and you are constantly bombarded with violence towards yourself and your family, you are going to develop that type of machismo, that type of "I'm a man" before anything else. So
Yeah.
when a person who has been given this historical conditioning, he's heard stories from his grandpa, his grandma, his older uncles about what it is to be a man and how you must defend yourself and assert yourself as a man. Man has a house. Man dominates his woman. Man dominates his children. When that's your conditioning and you see somebody who is something other than what they are assigned at birth. Someone who is openly and proudly and visibly queer. You're going to have a reaction to that. And you may not do anything. You may not queer bash them or anything. But especially if it's another black person, especially somebody that was originally male coded, like you're going to be angry and you're going to be upset and you're going to go down to the barbershop and you're going to rant and rave about how the white man is trying to destroy our communities with queerness and they're trying to breed out our race through queerness. Like I've heard many variations on that theme.
Yeah,
Well,
and I think that reminds me a little bit of kind of like some Filipino men, for example, like Manny Pacquiao, where I think that masculinity was kind of like, and the way that like it was breeded comes out of kind of like that strife, either whether that be from like classism or whether that be feudalism, and within like the working classes communities in the Philippines and stuff like that, there is definitely a lot of like machismo of kind of like the same flavor, where it's like we need to be able to defend ourselves from whatever comes from the ruling classes, or it comes from like, you know, rivals that we may have here. And I think that level of like machismo of like you have to be a man, you have to be able to protect your families like that, that kind of like leads to people having ideology like Manny Pacquiao that is so adverse to kind of like queerness, right? It's like, no, like we cannot like I that's not acceptable or whatever. It's like, oh, that's, I don't remember exactly what he said, but he, you know, was very queerphobic. And I think that is a result of kind of like conquest. I think that's a result of kind of like being attacked constantly, especially as like working class people. So like that's definitely like something that we need to keep in mind, especially when it comes to kind of like colonized communities, that like this is born out of like something. So yeah.
Yeah, and I've had to explain to many white comrades like black people are not inherently transphobic or queerphobic. I remember one time there was a comedian named Lil Duval. He said something to the gist of, if I hired a prostitute, okay, he's already fucking up because he's hiring prostitutes. But if I used a prostitute and she turned out to be a he, meaning having having sexual organs assigned to the male sex, then I would kill him. So he's engaging in the sex trade. He is expressing transphobic views and he's threatened violence towards somebody because of what they are. Anyways, this comedian came to town and he was during a show in a very black part of North County at a very black venue. And a lot of queer people um, were like, a lot of white queers were like, we need to go protest this. We need to go protest this. And I'm like, okay. And many other black queer people shared this view. Like, you're not being, I want to say dialectical, but you're not understanding like where this is coming from. First of all, white people, a bunch of white people, because no black person is stupid enough to do this, a bunch of white people are going to go up to this neighborhood that they've never been in. You haven't done any preparatory work. You haven't done any social investigation and class analysis. You haven't done any agitation or militancy against the show. So you're just going to show up there. You're going to block people off. Okay, these are working class and lumpen proletarian black people. So you're going to go up there, and the cops are going to come behind you because the cops always serve the interests of settlers, of white people, and you're going to get a bunch of people hurt and you're going to get a bunch of people arrested. And like, do you care? Or is this something like, what exactly is this going to achieve? You're not going to achieve anything by being a white person and going to a majority black neighborhood that you've probably never been to in your short little life and berating these people. So that's why the Maoist principle of unite the people and educate through patient struggle is the best. Now, am I saying that we should offer leeway or quarter to people who have done demonstrably violent and horrible things to queer people? Absolutely not. But there we have to keep in mind that the primary contradiction, the primary issue in the United States is national and racial in character. And if we forget that and we take what are at the time secondary or tertiary contradictions and make them primary, and we make them primary and we end up in an antagonistic relationship or an antagonistic contradiction with Black people or with Latino people or with other nationally oppressed people that we want to organize, then that's not to our benefit. That's not to the benefit of the queer movement, and it's not to the benefit of the socialist movement. That's something that I've constantly had to try to tell people.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. People just seem to want to superimpose their own ideas upon colonized peoples without understanding this principal contradiction in the world between imperialism and the oppressed nations. And it's just not going to work. I mean, we always have this with people, obviously very different experience, but even with Irish people, like people from, for example, Britain and the US, white people from Britain and the US and France and Germany being all, oh, nationalism, what a dead end that is, don't even bother with that. And it's like, well, there's national oppression, so we need that at this stage. You need to understand where we are, so so that we can actually work. We can't just jump from A to C. We need to go A, B, and C, and get through it step by step. Do you know what I mean? So there needs to be a resolving of that contradiction before we move on to the next one. And of course, that applies to all of these issues as well. You can't just go skipping stages and skipping steps and assuming people are going to be at the same place that the most advanced people among the masses are already at. It's our job, if you consider yourself to be a communist in particular. There's, of course, as we know, what we try to do is we try to unite the advanced, elevate the intermediates, and of course, those elements of the backwards masses who can be elevated, who can be spoken to. Try it, give it a go if you can, but if you can't, you have to isolate them. In these kinds of cases, we need to keep in mind where the intermediate masses are and how they would respond to such an action, like a bunch of white people going and protesting this guy. How would that reflect upon the intermediate masses, and how would they feel about that? I don't think they'd look too kindly on it. So, you need to understand where you're at and where you can go and where you can get from there.
Period. And I have a question. So where does queerphobia come from then? So we're talking a lot about like queerphobia. We're talking about like where it like what it is, how it manifests, but we still haven't asked the important question. Where does it come from? Well, as Marxists, we believe that all of like the oppression that we face today is rooted in the fact that we live under a class society. But Paul, do you want to expand on that a little bit? Because I know you marked this part as your own, so
that is my own.
Claim this part from us. So no, I'm kidding. I'm joking.
I stole it.
Go ahead.
No. I wrote a couple notes on this just because it is important that we have a firm basis to understand this matter from a Marxist perspective, from a scientific socialist perspective, because a lot of the perspectives that we get when it comes to queer emancipation and queer liberation, they're kind of vibes. There's a lot of vibes. There's a lot of liberal moralism that goes in there, and that can only get you so far. That can only get you so far in terms of actually delivering the goods, in terms of actually delivering liberation. We need to get to the root cause of what brought about this oppression in the first place. It's not just about saying, hey, queerphobia is not cool, just don't do it. No, there's more to it than that. There's a root cause for queerphobia, and as Marxists, we can understand that that root is private property itself, private property in class society. So I'm gonna go ahead and launch into this. Here we go. Little lecture here now for a moment. So bear with me, and I'll try and get through this as quickly as possible. But hopefully the message will come across pretty clearly. So what we call queerphobia or queer antagonism is a direct product of class society. All forms of class society, that is, be that slave society, feudalism, or capitalism. And of course, the patriarchy, which arose simultaneously alongside it. Now, patriarchy is a two-pronged mode of oppression, focusing on 1, the oppression of cishet women, and 2, the oppression of queer people. Now, both of these began systematically at the exact same moment in history during the transition period between primitive communism and class society. When we say primitive communism, we're generally talking about the old hunter-gatherer societies. Humanity as a species has only had class society for maybe about 15,000 years, whereas the human race has existed in its, modern anatomical form for about 300,000 years. So, you can imagine that this is the vast majority of humanity's existence was actually in a communal state of affairs, And so in these old primitive communal societies, these hunter-gatherer societies, the means of production that we talk about in Marxism, those that existed, these were held in common among the communities. Within this social order, there was no systemic patriarchal oppression, as these societies were general matriarchal. This matriarchy being a result of the more open sexual relations among people, which made it difficult to determine who the father of children were. As only the mother was known due to physically seeing the process of giving birth, these societies were matrilineal, with women holding much higher social positions in general. If that wasn't clear enough, people had much more open sexual relations, and you didn't really have the strict monogamous relations that we have now today, which are being opened up, of course, as we move forward. But historically, people were a lot looser, a lot more flexible with these things. You didn't have legal structures enforcing marriage for lifetime or anything like that. And so people would have sexual relations with many people, including many taboo sexual relations that we would think about today.
You get it, Paul. People fucked.
All kinds of people
did the do. People did the do. He said they got loose. Oh my God.
This is how Irish people address questions of sexuality. We still have the weight of a Catholic repression.
Catholic guilt.
Yeah, like I thought you all
on our shoulders.
I'm impressed. I thought you all were frigid and reserved. And
we talk about it a lot. We just dance around it. That's what we do. We just kind of dance around the question for more time than is necessary. But yeah, anyway, so moving on. As these societies moved from the communal ownership of property to private ownership of property, things began to really change. After this hunter-gatherer period, pastoralism and agriculture developed, which began to produce a surplus, so more than was needed, that was no longer held collectively, but privately. And this was coinciding with the move from the open tribal relationships towards monoamorous pairing relationships that we would come to know today. With this, and I'm going to quote from Engels, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, pages 29-30. With this, a division of labour emerged, wherein it was the man's part to obtain food and the instruments of labour necessary for the purpose. He therefore also owned the instruments of labour, and in the event of a husband and wife separating, he took them with him, just as she retained her household goods. Therefore, according to the social custom of the time, the man was also the owner of the new source of subsistence, the cattle, and later the new instruments of labour, the slaves. But according to the custom of the same society, his children could not inherit from him. Again, keeping in mind that these are matrilineal societies. So your mother, for example, a lot of people now, these days, they trace their surnames come from their father. That's patrilineage. Historically, they would have traced their origins through their mother before class society, before civilization. And so with pastoralism and agriculture, cattle were breeding and breeding, and wealth was growing relatively rapidly, far beyond the needs of those in the new paired-up private households. This allowed for the capturing of slaves, who could then be fed and kept alive indefinitely with that surplus. Slaves had children, and this labour force grew. With more food, more cattle, and more slaves, with the rise of this new surplus, men in particular grew wealthier, and their position within the family became more and more important, and of course then subsequently within society. But while the matrilineal mother right, as it was once called, remained of pre-class society, there was no way for him to pass on his private property to the next generation. What would become of his slaves, his cattle, and so on once he died? Inheritance occurred almost exclusively along the mother's lines. The only way for this private property to be passed down to a man's children, to continue to accumulate indefinitely, was if mother right was overthrown, and in its place was put a patrilineal system. This would facilitate inheritance based on the male line and allow the accumulation of private property to span across generations, eventually flourishing into full empires. And so that's exactly what happened. That's how we arrived at things like the ancient Athenian city-state and so on. Engels continues in the origins of family private property in the States on this moment, saying that the overthrow of mother right was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lusts and a mere instrument for the production of children. Again, this is a massive transformation from the pre-class society structures in which women were upheld as some of the most important people in every society. So there was a complete 180 here. And this is, of course, we know as the world historical defeat of the female sex, according to Marxism. You know, and so the patriarchal family was thus born, having successfully subjugated women. In order to ensure that the children who would inherit the property were biologically connected to the father, the pairing marriage now transformed into the monogamous marriage. That is, the legally enforced monogamous marriage, wherein you have a contract and people can't leave. When it started out, men were generally able to leave marriages pretty easily, but women had to stay in the marriages pretty much forever. And also, you know, there was no place for like cheating or anything like that for women. For men, they could more or less do whatever they wanted. And this brings us to the beginning of class society, from what's known as barbarism historically, problematically, to the beginnings of civilization, or slave society as what emerged. This, of course, could only be facilitated and generalized with the development of the slave state, which enforced private property relations and male supremacy, violently punishing all those who challenged it in any way. This continued with the feudal states and continues today with the capitalist states, each form of state manifesting with its own unique characteristics. Patriarchy and the patriarchal family unit, Patriarchy and the patriarchal family unit exist to this day to facilitate inheritance and the accumulation of capital, as well as the reproduction of labour. In other words, to protect and grow private property, and to ensure that people are able to labour with that private property in order to further accumulate capital for the ruling class. Anyone who impedes this process is punished accordingly, and the two groups that are incentivized most to break from this patriarchal order, the two groups whose freedom is inherently at odds with this state of affairs, are cishet women and LGBT plus people. Hence, the basis for queerphobia, for sexism, for patriarchy.
Yeah, awesome review, Paul. And I also want to add that while some kind of patriarchy and thus queerphobia has always existed in class societies across the world, queerphobia has become more uniformal and widespread since the advent of European colonialism and the imposition of white supremacist Christian patriarchal versions of class society, and in some societies, the imposition of class society, period. So when I'm referring to European colonialism, I'm talking about how it was driven by the class interests of the ruling forces of primarily European countries since 1492. The specific class interests at hand are those of primitive accumulation of foreign land, resources, and people as private property, capital, for the European feudalist and burgeoning bourgeois class, right? So I will use the Philippine archipelago as an example of this. So pre-Spanish colonialism, our archipelago had different types of societies that can broadly be characterized as, well, number one, primitive communal society in the north, mainly Luzon, where the land and resources of a community were communally owned and there wasn't much of a sexual division of labor. Secondly, semi-communal and semi-slave society in the Visayas, or the middle islands of our archipelago, which was a patriarchal society for sure, and engaged in laborial and sexual slavery. And there was some patriarchal private property inheritance laws, as well as some communally shared laws. And each barangay was led by a datu, which was always a man. But interestingly, the second most important person of this class society was the bebelan, which was a spiritual leader and always a woman, a cis or trans woman. because pre-colonial Visayan society did not have the same definition of gender as in Europe at the time. And finally, in the southern islands, such as Mindanao, feudalism. Mindanao was a caliphate at this point, and to this day remains a predominantly Muslim area in the Philippines. So their flavor of feudalism and thus patriarchy, instead of being inspired by Antagonism or Christian doctrine, was inspired by Islamic doctrine. However, after European colonialism, all of these different forms of societies, classless or with class, were destroyed and replaced with Spanish colonialism and feudal society. And due to this, as well as American colonization in the Philippines, which brought its own horrors, the Philippines remains semi-feudal and semi-colonial today, and queer people in the Philippines remain an oppressed class who suffer at the hands of the three basic problems of the Philippines: feudalism, imperialism, and bureaucrat capitalism. So that's what I would add to that. Do you have any thoughts, Black Red Guard?
That's a really, really interesting breakdown of pre-colonial Filipino society
Thank
and
you.
and its gender slash sex relations. And it's interesting that like the more a society develops, meaning advances towards capitalism, the more patriarchal and the more restrictive it gets. Whereas during the period, I guess Marx and Engels would call it primitive communism or communalism, it was pretty much um, you had land and property being held in common, and there was no sexual division of labor. Africa actually was very similar. Like if you go to northern Nigeria, which is heavily Muslim, it's like Mindanao. There's like that's where Boko Haram was, and all of these other different types of groups, and it's extremely, extremely restrictive. But if you go to, for example, a part of the Congo that still has a communal framework. I mean, of course, there's probably been some Christian missionary activity, but if they've rejected that and they've maintained their allegiance to the traditional way, you'll find a lot less restriction. Like Africa, West Africa, that's where my ancestors came from. Like there were a like people still have this sort of silly notion that African people are all living in huts and like no, you literally had states there. You had Dahomey, you had um Songhai. You had like very, very advanced and feudal types of organization. Islam played a pretty big role because West Africa was basically at the tail end of trade route from Arabia. Like it was Arabia, and then it came through North Africa, and it hit West Africa where there was a shitload of gold and salt and other stuff that the Arabs needed. And through this trade route also came Islam. Like people refer to Timbuktu as being somewhere that's unfathomably far. Like no, Timbuktu was basically like Oxford in the UK. Like that's where you want to study. And what did they study? Islam. So along with Islam came came a more like field type of organization. You had the Ali Mamo, you had the Imam, you had emirates, you had caliphates, just like in Mindanao. So you also had that type of patriarchy that sort of superseded the traditional ways of doing things there. So I found that parallel very interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I loved learning about that. And I love like how, I don't know, it makes me sad, but it also like makes me happy of thinking like how like in pre-colonial societies there was a lot of examples of kind of like non-class societies, but as well as like there was also examples of feudalism. And it makes me kind of like sad because all of these kind of like societies that did not conform to European colonialism, like we lost so much of like our identity as like a people because of that, you know? But at the same time, like it's really important and lovely to kind of like learn about this stuff because we can keep working kind of like towards that classless society and in a way that kind of like honors, at least in my case with like Tagalog people, like that honors our like past of being like anti kind of like class society, having a communal society and stuff like that. If you guys want to check out Filipino book that talks more about this, there's one called A History of the Philippines from Indios Bravos to Filipinos, written by Luis Francia, and there's also the beginning part of Philippine Society and Revolution by Kahoma, who is our in our thumbnail. Kahoma lives, rest in peace, rest in power, and yeah.
Yeah, I think this is really interesting as well. It's really interesting hearing about all over Africa and in the Philippines how just these strict sexual norms just didn't exist, and strict sexual and gender norms, I should say. Because we have this in Ireland as well, like before English colonialism, later British colonialism took hold in Ireland. People just didn't care. People, you could just do what you want. Nobody cared. Cuchulainn, as I've said this a few times now, people are probably, I probably sound like a broken record to some people when I say this, but the Hercules of Irish mythology, had sexual relations with a man. Ferdiad, one of the other great heroes of Irish mythology. And the thing is that nobody batted an eyelid at that. Nobody cared. That was just normal. It was like, yeah, he slept with his friends. They had an intimate romantic relationship, and that was just normal. That was normal up until the 1600s when Cromwell came in and ended the communal class relations that existed in Ireland under Gaelic Ireland specifically. There had, of course, been parts of Ireland that had been colonised successfully by that point already. But Gaelic Ireland did still exist. The free parts of Ireland didn't have these strict sexual mores that you see in the more quote, civilized and developed parts of the world that came to be associated with, of course, slave society, feudalism, and capitalism. So very interesting how you see this emerging all over the world, not just in the Philippines, not just in Africa, also here in Ireland,
Well, I remember reading, I can't remember if it was a Roman or a Greek historian, but I was on like a classics kick a
Oh, yeah.
while ago. I'm kind of
I
getting
know what
back
you're going
into
to say.
reading. Yeah, I'm reading Herodotus. Anyways, I think one of them referred to what would become the Gaels or the Celts as being like basically gay as fuck.
Hell yeah.
Yep. Like the Greeks were
Wish we
they
could turn
blushed.
back time.
Literally, we made the Greeks blush with how with our activities, let's say. Yeah, still do, but anyway.
Is that an economics joke?
I can't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can't.
I
LOL.
thought Ireland was one of the most well-developed economies in the EU, but that's none of my business.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, if you count American capitalism developing in Ireland, we are definitely the most one of the most advanced economies. American capitalism is super developed in Ireland.
Ugh, I can't wait until I do an archaeological dig in Ireland and
Literally,
just discover all the gay stuff, all the gay like pins that they made anciently. LOL.
yeah. So
We should probably move on.
yeah, well, maybe we'll move on to talk a little bit about queer liberation and the left, the quote unquote left, and how Marxist movements, how communist movements historically have related to the movement for queer liberation. Does anyone want to take this to talk a little bit about this? Instances where, for example, communists and socialists and progressives have sided with the movement for queer liberation, and also perhaps instances where maybe communists haven't been so good, haven't lived up to everything we should have with regard to the movement for emancipation from queer oppression. Anyone wanna jump into that?
I volunteer Black Red Guard to do it.
Okay, thank you. All right, so yeah, the history of the communist movement, socialist movement, what have you, and the queer movement's kind of fraught with a lot of bad stuff. It's actually been a major sticking point in our work with with queer people who are not already communists, because they're like, oh, Stalin did this, and like the Cultural Revolution was extremely restrictive, and which is a lie. But like that's the myth that a lot of queer people have, because queer people are not immune to anti-communist conditioning. And then for two, like, communists have actually done some pretty fucked up shit in regards to queer people historically. So the best way to handle this type of thing is not to make excuses for it, because when you make excuses for objectively horrible things that would never fly, that were promoted by people who were born in the fucking 1800s, when you do stuff like that, it just makes you look ridiculous, and it makes you look less than serious. You're more interested in defending this menagerie of dead people than you are in actually dealing with the questions of our time. Not saying that we should not have the utmost respect for our revolutionary elders and those who climbed mountains and crossed rivers before us, but we also should recognize that they did some objectively fucked up shit. So, starting with the positive, probably the sort of gold standard for queer allyship on the left would be Huey P. Newton. If you know anything about the Black Panther Party, you know that this party was a very eclectic party. Like, everybody tries to claim them, and it's so frustrating. Like, they drew from a variety of sources. They drew from Malcolm X. They drew from the Nation of Islam. They drew from Mao, of course. George Jackson talked about reading Trotsky in prison. So they do not really belong to anybody but themselves and the new African nation. Anyways, many issues with homophobia and misogyny and queerphobia in general in the party. You have Eldridge Cleaver running around calling everybody a faggot. You've got all sorts of horrible things going on. Huey P. Newton, keep in mind, no organization, black, white, left, what have you, had done this before, came out in full support for the queer liberation struggle just mere months after Stonewall happened. So the gist of his speech, I'm going to quote him here, was that we should be willing to discuss the insecurities that many people have about homosexuality. When I say insecurities, I mean the fear that they are some kind of threat to our manhood. I can understand this fear because of the long conditioning process that builds insecurity in the American male. Homosexuality might produce certain hangups in us. I have hangups myself about male homosexuality, but on the other hand, I have no hangup about female homosexuality, typical straight man. And that is a phenomenon in itself. I think it is probably because male homosexuality is a threat to me and female homosexuality is not. We should be careful about using these terms that might turn our friends off. The terms faggot and punk should be deleted from our vocabulary, and especially we should not attach names normally designed for homosexuals to men who are enemies of the people, such as Nixon or Attorney General Mitchell. Homosexuals are not enemies of the people. We should try to form a working coalition with the gay liberation and women's liberation groups. We must always handle social forces in the most appropriate manner. So Huey, in 1970, 53 years ago, is coming out saying, leave queer people alone. They are our friends. They are not our enemies. Stop queer bashing. So 53 years ago, you had this guy who was more advanced than a pretty worrisomely large chunk of the American left, who seems to think that all queer people are imperialists or trans people are groomers, all of these ridiculous right-wing myths. And here you have Huey, a man who admittedly was not perfect, demonstrating the capacity to change according to objective social phenomenon and study and research. So that's kind of the gold standard. So it's always best to lead with the positives. And of course, today we have the Communist Party of the Philippines, which is probably the strongest ally of the movement for queer liberation within the ICM. keep in mind that gay marriage, queer marriage is still illegal in the Philippines today. This is 2023. Whereas the CPP MPA has been facilitating queer marriages within the liberated zones since the early 2000s. So gay marriage has technically been legal in red base areas longer than it has been legal in the United States. So those are probably the two gold standards. And it's funny, like I brought this up with a pet stock I was arguing with. I think it was Haas. I'm not sure. One of those, they all like give themselves the same types of names. Anyways, and they were like, oh, they're just imperialists. They did that to appeal to the Western left. I'm like, first of all, I don't think the CPP gives a shit about what the Western left thinks. But like, it is just so funny to me. It kind of mirrors these rightists who think that like all queer shit, like that's how they think about it, talk about it. Queer shit is somehow funded by George Soros. Like, no, people want to get married. They don't want to get beaten up for being gay or holding hands with their partner in public. Like, they always act as if queer people are demanding some sort of special rights above and beyond. No, we just want the ability to be left the fuck alone and have the same rights and treatment that everybody else does. That is no problem. That's no issue. The regressives are the ones who have problems with people existing in public and using the fucking bathroom in corporations deciding that they want to put rainbow flags to get gay money. It's just so ridiculous to me that this is the sort of flashpoint of American cultural discourse in the year 2023. Like a highway just fucking collapsed in Philadelphia. And we have to defend ourselves against people who have decided that this is something that they want to spend the majority of their political time on.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that too, where it's like there are people who are working 2 or 3 jobs and not being able to afford living by themselves in this country, and they have decided that their biggest tirade is against like schools having rainbow flags in their classrooms or something like that. And on your point on the Communist Party of the Philippines and how people I don't know who he was. I don't care. Some guy like on Twitter that was like they're doing that to be to appeal to the Western masses. First of all, LOL. Like the CPP poses an actual threat to the US imperialist presence in the Philippines. So I don't think they're trying to appeal to the United States in any sort of way, especially since even organizers, grassroots organizers who are not affiliated with the CPP at all, their murders are justified by saying, oh, it's because they were part of the CPP. So I don't think if their strategy was somehow to be pro-queer to get George Soros money or whatever they claim it is, then they're doing pretty bad at it, because it's like Filipinos who are part of the National Democratic Movement are continuously being targeted by the US like propaganda. Meanwhile, this guy, I don't know who he is, but I'm assuming he makes money off streams based on saying some bullshit like this. How is he being oppressed by the US like imperialist state, right? So I think it's really interesting that we go and we rely on immaterial kind of like feelings to justify our hatred or our stances against the queer community. I say "are" very lightly. I'm more specifically talking about, these MAGA communist nuts that are on the internet. But yeah, no, it got me thinking about that for sure.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. It's not just the MAGA communist nutjobs. It's been basically anybody who has been a questionable socialist for a long time. People like Paul Cockshott, the RCP
Wait,
USA.
What is this man's name?
I don't know.
Paul Cockshott.
Cockshott.
And did you know that the origins of the name Paul are that actually means small? Did you know that?
Paul?
Paul means
Oh,
small. Yeah.
small cock. Oh.
So
Little cockshot. My God, the names
So
Anglos have.
he has been quite vehemently opposed not only to trans liberation but just to LGBT plus liberation in its entirety. And I mean, he's been a reactionary his entire life. Going back, he's been completely reactionary on the Irish national struggle and a thorn in the side of basically every progressive movement for the last fucking 50 years. Um, but one of the things that they do, and I think that this really shows how they have zero regard for dialectical materialism, is that they basically can't understand how one divides into two, and how you can see these different currents and different trends within these movements. How yes, you will be able to find queer capitalist imperialist bourgeoisie, but the vast majority of queer people are proletarian, are working class and oppressed masses, and they just don't seem to want to reckon with that fact. They just point to Mr. Rich gay white man in the United States of America, and that's the end of it. So they just see the movement for LGBT plus liberation as just this one homogenous block. They don't understand these different class positions that exist within the movement, and they just focus on these rightist, assimilationists, reformist, and pro-capitalist elements within it. They just don't look at the revolutionary, radical, anti-imperialist trends which the entire movement emerged from in the first place. And then they just point to those and say, see, look, the entire thing is simply a bourgeois movement to reinforce capital and blah, 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 blah. And of course, this ignores the fact that has been raised before in this stream, that it's actually working class, black and brown, queer people, and particularly trans people who are at the vanguard of revolutionary struggle and progressive movements. You said in the USA earlier on in the stream, but all over the world at the moment. We see queer people leading the struggles in the Philippines as well, the CPP MPA. So it just doesn't square with the fact. It just doesn't square with material reality when you look beyond the illusions that they put up. But that's it. It's an illusion. It's a paper tiger.
Yeah, in my opinion, and like I can be incorrect basically, but the relationship between the queer community and communist revolutionaries or socialist countries or self-described ones have always been very dramatic, right? They're either incredibly good, embarrassingly bad, or aggravatingly neutral, in my opinion. So like when communist revolutionaries take a principled stance in support of the queer community, like Huey or like the CPP, usually it's a really advanced stance. It's a really great stance that like really kind of encapsulates the needs and wants of the queer community, right? For example, they reverse anti-people legislation upon seizure of power. Even the Bolshevik Revolution in the 1920s did the queer community in the Soviet Union a huge favor by abolishing the sodomy laws, which had been like put in place by the Russian like empire. But unfortunately, Stalin then rolled them back and criminalized homosexuality later on. And in an opposite manner, and again, I like whether or not we believe this country is socialist is not the point in this instance, but like the revolutionary government of Cuba has gone from being kind of like hostile towards like gay people in the 1960s and 70s to being the most progressive, having the most progressive family penal code in the world and being a safe haven and protector of trans and gay youth. I don't know why it's hard for me to talk right now, but anyway, and I have scoured the internet for anything trustworthy about the revolutionary China under Mao's I can't speak. I don't know. Revolutionary China under Mao's relationship with the queer community in China. But unfortunately, I can't find anything. If anyone finds anything, send it to me. And of
I
course,
actually found like an article on it. Hold on.
really?
Yeah,
No.
I read from it in my last stream on hold on. I'll find it and I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, okay. All right, awesome. Okay. Lovely. Maybe we can read it out later. But yeah, I think that just the fact that anti-imperialist people's movements worldwide, especially the revolutionary left wing of it, are usually one of the most socially progressive and pro-queer sectors in their countries today, right? And especially when it comes to like Maoist revolutionaries today, we already talked about the Communist Party in the Philippines, but their one of the most like socially progressive forces in their country that actually pose a big threat to their patriarchal class societies. For example, the Maoists in India and Afghanistan, Turkey, and more places with their violent opposition to patriarchy, right? And also even in like cases of like the Soviet Union, I believe like kind of like failed in their stance towards the queer community. And yet today in like in those areas, communist revolutionaries that have like, you know, a revolutionary instead of reformist ideology are one of the biggest supporters of the Eastern European like queer community there. And from like socialist Irish Republicans to the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines to the economic freedom fighters in South Africa, like all of these movements that are progressive, that are people centered, um, they have a stance that is pro queer because what they do is that they reflect the needs of the masses now that we also understand as communists and as Marxists that queerphobia is rooted in like class society as well, just as patriarchy is. So I think that when we talk about how the queer community and the left has had a bad history, I think that we should also talk about how it has a pretty good future, because I think that people in our movement understand that like our history has been pretty bad in like the past, right? And now all we can do is repair that by doing what many of the people that we study didn't go far enough in doing, right? Like, for example, when it comes to Stalin, when it comes to, I'm assuming, Engels and Marx as well, that we need to push through and get to those exploited masses who are being let down right now by the Western liberal governments that said that represented them, right? So that's how I feel about that. But anyway.
Yeah, really, really well put. I'm not sure if Black Redguard, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that, or do you want to proceed?
No, not really. It was a very, very good breakdown. But um, in terms of the Maoist movement's treatment of queer people, like I put the article that I mentioned earlier, well, by earlier, I mean like 2 minutes ago, in the chat about same-sex relations in socialist China. And one piece that I found interesting was out of the red closet, because probably the most well-known Maoist, obviously we all know that they're a revisionist horrible formation, but they were like at one time the sole Maoist party as such in the United States. I'm talking about the RCP, and they're very notorious for two things: their horrible stance on busing, where they ended up in bed with Louise Day Hicks, who was like a very virulent anti-busing um, activist. If you don't know what busing is because you're not
Oh my
American, it was
God.
basically, yeah, um, it was basically an experiment to see how you could remediate segregation in schools, because like in the late 70s schools were still heavily segregated, Boston in particular. So they would just take black kids from black neighborhoods and send them via school bus to schools in white neighborhoods. And white Boston did not like that very much. They threw rocks at and burned buses with kids on them and did a whole bunch of other things. Anyways, the RCP opposed busing because they thought that it was bourgeois meddling in the affairs of the masses or some such happy horseshit. And the second thing that they're known for is their position on gay and lesbian and otherwise queer members. So I've got this libcom article that sums up a critique of the party, and it says that in 1973, the Revolutionary Union published On Homosexuality, which is a paper justifying the exclusion of homosexuals for being decadent, bourgeois, and counter-revolutionary. The RCP had this line all the way up until 1988. In 1988, due to the growth of the gay rights movement, so they're already being opportunists here, particularly concerning the AIDS epidemic and attacks by the religious right and increasing resistance to both pressure mounts on the RCP to change its line. So a compromise was made. The new line advocated on the question of homosexuality and the emancipation of women. It softened its tone, but still attacked homosexuality. Only now it was just contributing to female oppression and narcissistic rather than completely counter-revolutionary. So we have the Maoist Party in the United States. Like when Gonzalo was arrested, he had a poster of Bob Avakian in his hideout. So yeah, they were basically the representative of Maoism in the United States for like 30 years.
Oh my
But
God.
they're classifying queer people as decadent, bourgeois, counter-revolutionary. And then in 1988, they just decided that we're narcissistic. And then they ignored, they did no self-criticism and nothing. They changed their line, did a full 180 in 2001, and they drafted a new policy which they claimed is now pro-homosexual and allowed gay members. So all the way up until the 21st century, you had the Maoist Party in the United States excluding gay members because we were bourgeois, decadent, anti-woman, and narcissistic. So horrible. And there were many, many people who saw their their orientation, their queerness as being tertiary to who they are, who chose to remain in the closet in the RCP, subjecting themselves to immense torture and fear that if they were ever found out that they would be kicked out of the party. So that is a prime example of what not to do as a party. Thankfully, in the year 2023 and the rise of Twitter and all of the other things that can get you canceled really fast, no party would ever really like embrace this position knowingly, especially in the terminally online imperial core. But like it's just amazing that they had this for so long and nobody came to them and was like, you know what, this is fucking horrible. Like we have the AIDS crisis going on. We have queer people rising up and actually extracting concessions from the state. Like there was a group called ACT UP, and they did all sorts of good shit. Like they took over the New York Stock Exchange,
Yeah.
not like with weapons, but they were trying to get the price of because these companies, big pharma is very good at price gouging. They do it with insulin. Back in the day, they were doing it with AIDS medication. So they basically occupied the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and the pharmaceutical company that was making this drug eventually dropped the price. Ronald Reagan did not give a shit about AIDS. He thought it was funny. So they leaned on the CDC and the FDA and various other federal agencies and got some very good reforms. The RCP ignored all of that. Why? Because decadent, homosexuals, disgusting. And when I was getting into it with Pat Socks on Twitter, which I really need to stop doing, it's not good for your mental health.
It is not.
But
It is not.
when I was doing that, like they were constantly bringing up Stalin and Krelenko or one of those Inkos or Ovs or somebody. And like you have to take into account that Stalin reversed the USSR's very advanced position on queer rights because he saw the need, especially in light of the fact that there was a literal world war cooking, not justifying it in any way, but he saw the church, the very strong, historically Russian Orthodox Church, as being a necessary ally to unite the country in preparation for World War II. That's the justification that I've always seen. But that was a rightist like thing to do. Like, why would you go backwards, especially if you are the world's first proletarian state? to appeal to people who would happily destroy the entire Soviet Union. Like the Russian Orthodox Church
Yeah.
made the Romanov saints, and they built a church on the ground where they were killed. So that's just an example of what happens in historical consequences for the future when you cave in and when you engage in rightism instead of being like, nope, this is what we're doing. We're not going to try to appeal to reactionaries for a false sense of unity. Because if I recall correctly, it was the church that played a major role in the collapse of the USSR.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks. That was their reward.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that like this point that you're bringing up about how like the Maoist Party in the United States for such a long time had that like position. It doesn't like, to me sometimes when I'm arguing with people and they're like, "Oh no, like Maoists are inherently like homophobic or whatever." Like I can't like understand that in this context because like I think of the Philippines and that's what I think of. But knowing this and knowing that like the Maoist Party in the United States until the 21st century was saying that, like I can't blame the masses in the United States like that maybe we're interested at some point in like Marxism, but then when they approached these like organizations, these parties, like they were like discriminated against. Like I think that's a huge like that has been a huge kind of like push backwards for like anti-revisionism as like an ideology. And like I think that that's a huge kind of like what's it called, distrust that we need to like invest a lot of like energy into repairing here in the United States. Because like of course like in the Philippines it's not like that, but the masses here in the United States are not seeing that, right? What they see when they think of Maoists is that, and also all of the anti-communist propaganda that like is spewed at them, whether that be like, oh, the Cultural Revolution was like socially conservative, or like, you know, citing things that Stalin did or actually or did not do, you know. So yeah, no, I was thinking about that as well. So I guess the question now is like, what should we what should be our positions as Marxists towards the queer community, right? What should we do then if we don't do what was done in the past and we can take inspiration by some good things? What is our way forward? I think I'm going to pass this off to Paul now to talk about this a little bit more.
Well, I'll put it simply, the only correct position on this is absolute support for queer liberation, and especially within queer liberation, trans liberation particularly. Just in 2023, that's where we need to be focused. That's where the antagonisms are at their highest level, you know. The fight for queer emancipation is the fight against patriarchy. The fight against patriarchy is the fight against class society itself and the private property upon which it's based. That is to say, this is the fight for stateless, classless, moneyless society, or communism. The fight for communism. And we need to help people understand that. We need to educate, agitate, organize the people, help them to understand how we can actually abolish the root cause of queer oppression. How do we do that? We abolish private property. And so when we have that in mind, when we have that basic position of support for queer emancipation, once we have that basic position, we need to also, of course, keep in mind this question of class standpoints and keep that at the forefront when we're approaching this movement for queer liberation. The members of the bourgeoisie who support LGBT plus rights that don't impinge upon their ability to economically exploit the working class, including the queer working class, these guys, they're unlikely to be reliable allies of any sort in the struggle for socialism, in the struggle to abolish all forms of oppression. Unless you find the occasional Frederick Engels, but I don't think you're going to find that many class traders among the imperialist bourgeoisie, to be honest. So yeah, that's it. That's what I would think. What do you guys think?
Retweet. So true.
I just talked about Twitter being bad for our mental health, and yet we're reaching. But
the term in the online Western left.
Yeah. Oh, I hope I didn't create another meme. But yeah, the main thing is that what can the left do to support queer people? It's mainly like acknowledging that in this culture war thing. Like people are, and I don't even refer to it as a war lightly, because like people are killing and dying for these reactionary beliefs. Like it seems like once a month a Nazi or a reactionary of some type or other goes on a transphobic, goes on a homophobic rant and decides to grab his or her AR-15 and start killing. So this is a literal culture war. And queer people, especially trans people, are in the vanguard of this. We had a shooting a few years ago. Somebody went into a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, and just opened fire. And the important thing is to realize that when you have a group of people that it is literally legally okay to harass, like we have Elon Musk, the world's richest man, who owns Twitter, which is a major source of news for millions of people. He is liking and retweeting transphobic shit. Like, those people are the vanguard. Fred Hampton said that you could tell who the vanguard is by who the pigs hate. The pig Elon Musk, the pigs in Congress, Marjorie Taylor Greene, all these people, the pigs with guns hate trans people. So it's important that we stand 100% with trans people and be willing and ready to put our bodies on the line when they become attacked. Like, I see so many organizations that are acting like there is a legal solution to all of this.
Yeah.
And I've actually softened my position, and I've noticed a lot of Maoists doing this. Like 2020, 2019, like we were hardcore, no elections, no reforms, PPW now. Of course, I think as we get older and with the collapse of the those who shall not be named, I think we've matured a lot, and we're like, hey, DSA, the rank and file, most of them are not our enemies. There's a lot of queer people in that group, and maybe leaving pigs' heads where they meet is not the best option. So I see a lot of united front work being done. I see a lot of potential for unity of queer people across organizations, not on an unprincipled basis, not unity for the sake of unity, but on the basis that if we do not work together, if we are not on speaking terms with one another, we will all be dead. So developing that type of unity, I'm not talking about Minecraft shit on the stream because I don't want Paul to get in trouble. And I also don't want to get in trouble. I like myself more than I like Paul. But um like realizing that like time is up for playing. It's time to actually start doing what we're talking about. I think that's how the left can best support queer people. As for people
Yeah.
who have like flat out anti-queer positions, reactionaries, thankfully they're so small that they're so small. They're a small fish in a small pond. So like they're irrelevant. Like their positions, their lines are not really catching credence among anybody. But these types of people still have the potential to do god awful things. So they need monitoring. They should not be seen as allies, and they should be treated like any other reactionary.
The only thing I want to add to that is that um, when we are talking about how people are going out of their way, reactionaries are going out of their way to go and protest like queer events or drag shows, right? And like posing like an actual physical threat to like queer people, and like this hatred, as you said, is manifesting in like actual like violent attacks, homicidal attacks against the queer community. So people, the masses, they can trust people who are there for them. And as we are the masses, we're here on this stream, you know, we want to make sure that like we are protecting ourselves. And by doing that, we have to serve the people. So if people are going to attack these events, our role should be to go and be a barrier between that. that is like the primary thing that we should invest in, I believe, is being like there when these people like are under threat, like queer community. I mean, it's my community, right? Because I'm bisexual myself. Like, we have to be there. We have to be presently there and ready to fight this off. So yeah, that's like the main thing. I think the first step is that, is being there.
All right, I literally couldn't have put that better myself. That was phenomenal. That was fantastic. And I think that that might have been a really, really nice place to end the stream today. I know we've been going for about 2 hours, nearly 2 hours at this stage. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that either of you would like to say, Black Redguard or Anna? Any shout outs?
Not at all.
Any love you want to give?
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Black
Happy
Redguard,
Pride
anything?
hit somebody. Happy Pride hit somebody in the head with the brick.
All right, as we say, yeah, Pride is a protest. Pride is born from a riot. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in. Hope you have enjoyed this. As always, make sure to subscribe to Black Redguard's channel. You'll find the link to the YouTube channel below this in the description box, as well as his Twitch channel. He has a new Twitch channel where he's having a lot of fun, playing some video games, having a bit of crack, playing Red Dead Redemption. I think that's your name, isn't it? Black Red Dead Redemption or something like that.
Yeah, the thing is, I got to get a fucking Ethernet extender for my router because, like, the thing with like streaming from Xbox on Wi-Fi, it's not going to work. So I have to literally extend the Wi-Fi and then like plug in a Ethernet cord. Shit, that might not even work. I don't fucking know.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll just play Civ all day.
Just play some old games.
Yeah.
Minecraft. Yeah. All right, folks. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this. Enjoy Pride Month. Have a good one. Stay safe. I'm not gonna advocate doing anything with bricks, but our guests might have had some good advice with that. Gramil Malgwiv, August Slán go fóill.